right. Hi. How you doing, Bruce?
I'm well. How are you,
I'm
Jesse?
doing very well, thank you. So, today I was just wanting to kind of go through your life journey. Just a little bit of an introduction, maybe. You are an artist who has been teaching at Gordon for many, many years.
Hmm.
In fact, really essential in the beginning of the art department at Gordon. And I just talking to my friends and even the conversations we've had, you tend to have a very big impact on your students and are the type of person who, through your teaching and through conversations, have really been able to share from your own life in ways that have shaped people in really positive ways. That's just stuff that I've heard from my friends. That's stuff that I've experienced. So I just wanted to get you on the podcast and kind of go through some of your life and some of the key things that you've learned, some of the key experiences you've had, so that I can share that then with my listeners and have hopefully similar impacts on them.
No, it's a real pleasure, Jesse, to be part of this effort, and I look forward to our conversation.
That's awesome. So I like to start, maybe take it back. Where did you grow up?
Well, I was born in Montclair, New Jersey,
Okay.
but we only lived there for about 6 months of
All
my
right.
life, and then we moved to Virginia, and we lived in three different places in Virginia. But I was in Virginia till I was about 9 years old.
Okay.
Then we moved up to upstate New York. We lived in Rochester, New York for about 3 years, and then right when I was about 12, we moved to Buffalo.
Okay.
About 3 years later, we moved to Atlanta.
Wow.
And by the time I was 17, I had had enough of moving.
I would think so.
Uh, and my parents were about to move again.
Hmm.
And that would have meant a second high school, well, actually a third high school.
Wow.
So I decided to leave home when I was 17.
Wow.
And I said, well, if I'm going to move around, I'm going to do it on my own.
Right.
So I hitchhiked around the country.
Whoa.
I landed in South Carolina and spent a few years there working for an artist as his assistant and gardener and studio assistant. And then he said to me at one point, Bruce, you're a talented kid, but that's not enough. Talent's never enough. He said, you need to go to art school and see
Wow.
if you can survive.
Yeah.
And I said, where should I go to art school? He said, I don't think New York's a great fit for you. How about Boston? I
Yeah.
said, all right. So I packed up my car 2 weeks later and I moved to Boston.
Wow.
So I am from this area as far as I'm concerned, because I've been
Yeah.
here since I was 19
Wow.
and I'm 63. So
Yeah.
better
Live
part of
more
my life.
life here than anywhere
Yeah.
else.
Mostly Gloucester, Massachusetts. So when people say, where are you from? I guess I have to say, I think I'm from Gloucester.
Yeah, that's you've become one of them, one of the artists from Gloucester.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, so your parents, why did they move so much? Was it a job situation or?
Yeah, my dad was in the corporate world and he kept getting promoted. And every time he got promoted, they wanted to relocate
A
him.
new office, yeah. Okay. And then did you have any siblings?
Yep. Three brothers.
Yeah.
Actually, four brothers. One died in infancy.
Oh, wow.
And my older brother died when he was 18. When I was 17, just
Oh, you were
before I left
17.
home.
Do you think
Yeah.
that had a huge impact on leaving home at that point?
It probably did, but at the time I wouldn't have said yes.
Right.
I don't think I was all that connected with my own emotional life at that time. I was
Well,
just
you
was a
were
kid.
17,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's crazy. And how did he pass away?
It's a long story, but all that stuff you've read about the 1960s.
Yeah.
Well, that was true of my brother and me.
Wow.
And he went to Woodstock. He was very thirsty. I don't know if you read about or seen any of the films on Woodstock. But
Yeah, I've seen the
it was a
documentary
mud
before.
fest, and it
Yeah.
was also a heat wave fest. And he was really thirsty one day, and some guy offered him some Kool-Aid, which happened to be laced with the strongest LSD
Wow.
that was available.
Wow.
And he had a horrendous mental breakdown
Oh,
as a
man.
result of that experience. And he never was the same, and he took his own life.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's terrible. So that's amazing to me to even just to start with, because it often seems that in the midst of those crazy, insane suffering or pain
Mhm.
that people go through and being close to that, that there's a depth that kind of tends to build in a person. And that can often lead to, either unhealthy ways of expressing itself, but also it can lead to wisdom or an empathy or a sensitivity, I guess. How do you feel like in that time you were wrestling with it? Obviously not on a conscious level, as you're
Yeah.
saying, you may not have been in touch with your emotions, but you're setting out on this journey to try and find yourself, find where you belong, that type of stuff. What kind of key things do you think you were wrestling with there?
Well, one way of framing it might be helpful. My dad was a very kind and very loving father,
Hmm.
also an extremely effective businessman.
Mm.
salesman.
Right.
And that's part of the reason he kept getting promoted.
Yeah.
Everybody liked him,
Mm-hmm.
and all the corporate clients liked him, and so he was enormously successful.
Mm.
As you can imagine, moving around like that and getting ripped out of every social context was devastating for our
Yeah.
family. And my dad really didn't have enough wisdom at the time
To see that.
to know that he had to turn down some of these promotions or change jobs or do something to support the need his family might have
Yeah.
for a sense of rootedness. And unlike the military, which has a lot of supports in place for people that have to move around a lot,
Of course.
there were no supports in place.
Yeah.
None.
Mm.
And so it was really hard on my mom, and eventually it was catastrophically hard on her.
Yeah.
It was hard on my brothers and me. And so it's kind of an American dream gone bad,
Right.
turned
Right.
nightmare.
Yeah.
He was the American dream. It's sort of almost like that Horatio Alger story, the
Yeah.
rags to riches or bootstraps to, to the country club. And we started out very poor. He was
Yeah.
a door-to-door salesman. He sold vacuum cleaners door to
Wow.
door. And that
Wow.
same company, the Hoover Company,
Right.
saw that he was amazing. He sold so many vacuum cleaners, they made him a district manager. Then
Mm.
he saw he was so good at that, they made him a branch manager. And then by the time he retired, he was in charge of everything east of the Mississippi from Florida to Maine.
Wow.
And they wanted to make him vice president of the company.
Wow.
And he refused. And finally he had gained
They
enough
got through
wisdom.
him. Yeah.
And he realized he had to make some decisions for my mom.
Yeah.
And that's when they moved back to Richmond.
Mm.
They stayed there for the rest of their life.
Right.
But he retired very young. He was a year younger than I am when he retired.
Wow. So you were.
So it was an American nightmare,
Yeah.
American dream turned nightmare.
Right.
I was a kid. As a kid, I was an artist kid from the time as far back as I remember. So I reacted to things a little bit differently than my brother
Of course.
and my younger brothers. Not that I want to say artists are special, but we are a little bit different.
Yeah.
And one of the ways that artists are different is that we tend to process things differently.
Yeah.
And so that pain of being ripped out of a social context every time migrated deep into me and made me explore the inner world really in a really rich and nuanced way. And so my inner life was very intense by the time I was 14 years old.
Right.
And I got involved in a kind of a spiritual seeking
Yeah.
back in the 60s. And
Right.
yeah.
And so at that time, was your family would have said Christian, or would they?
They were nominally Episcopalian.
Right.
We went to church on Sundays when I was little, and then we stopped going to church, but then occasionally would go on Easter or
Right.
Christmas, that kind of thing.
Absolutely. So do you feel like the ideas of Christianity were really present at that time?
Yeah. I mean, my parents, if you'd asked them, are they Christians, they would have said, absolutely.
Of course. Yeah.
And if you had them read the Apostles' Creed and asked them, do you believe this? They would have said yes.
Yeah.
But then if you'd asked them to explain,
Right.
they would have gone blank.
Which seems to be kind of stereotypical of that time frame too.
Yeah, 1950s.
Everyone in America was
Exactly.
Christian.
Exactly. And they believed, but they didn't have much content to their belief.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So
So I
then
could go on about
yeah.
that. I mean, yeah, but there was that
That
Christian
grain.
grid,
Yeah.
but it wasn't like growing up in an evangelical family
Of
or
course. Yeah.
some born again Christian family where everybody's talking about the Bible all the time.
Right,
We never
right.
talked about it.
Right.
We might have said the Lord's Prayer
Right.
at bedtime when I was little,
Right.
but that ended probably by the time I was 10 years old. So.
Yeah. So then you're spiritually seeking and you're going out on a hitchhiking trip across the country.
Yeah.
What do you feel like? Where would you have landed in those times? Like what was shaping? What type of things were you valuing? Stuff like that.
Great question. Well, I mean, another thing you might have read about the 1960s was not only was there the exploration of mind-changing, mind-altering drugs, but there was also the seeking of mystical experience,
Yeah.
trying to find ecstatic spiritual experience outside of the confines of organized religion.
Right.
And one of the things that was gaining some popularity in the mid-60s when I was old enough to start reading these things was Buddhism, Zen. There was one popularizer of Eastern thought. His name was Alan Watts. He's written a bunch of books. He taught at UC Berkeley.
Oh yeah.
He also had a radio show on public radio. Brilliant, really persuasive, incredibly magnanimous kind of intellect. And I read some of Alan Watts's books and got really interested in Eastern philosophy, in particular in Zen, but also in meditating and trying to find meaning and get away from the rat race of status seeking and money and the stuff that, I mean, I always admired and loved my dad, but the things I didn't like were the way he made his decisions, which seemed to be all around money, or around. It wasn't that my dad was greedy. It was that
Right.
he was part of that corporate system, and I
Yeah.
saw problems with that from the time I was little.
Right.
By the time I was in my mid-teens, 14, 15 years old, I completely rejected it.
Yeah.
The business world seemed to me to be antithetical to everything I cared about. And I started getting involved in Buddhism and Zen,
Right.
Zen Buddhism, and then other things. One thing led to another. I think I was probably 15 years old, 16 years old maybe, when I first encountered the teachings of Meher Baba,
Mm.
a sage from India, was born in Pune, India. Um, he was a kind of wunderkind. He spoke 5 languages
Mm.
fluently, was brilliant,
Yeah.
but he was his name was Merwan Irani. Um, he was from the Parsi community. They were had migrated to India from Persia many centuries ago,
Mm.
but still were Zoroastrians.
Right.
Kind of a religion most people haven't heard of around here.
Of course.
But Merwan Irani had an ecstatic encounter with God when he was about 21 years old, and that brought him into the precincts of a whole tradition in India of these spiritual masters
Mm.
who, for lack of a better way of saying it, were adepts
Yeah.
in this world of ecstatic spirituality and mysticism.
Right.
And one thing led to another. He ended up becoming one of those masters, and then he had a small following, international following, and I encountered Meher Baba's followers, and they were luminous, bright, welcoming, friendly folks
Yeah.
who had a lot of interesting ideas, and
Yeah.
I got involved.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, so involvement at that level, was that, you're saying, was that also during your hitchhiking times, or was that, yeah, so,
Yeah, and it was when it started when I was in Atlanta.
yeah.
One of the first places I lived after I left home was a spiritual commune in downtown Atlanta.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was a kind of a it was a commune.
Yeah.
It was all people had different. Some people were into hatha yoga. Other
Right.
people were into different kinds of meditation techniques. I was a follower of Meher Baba.
Right.
And eventually, the reason I moved to South Carolina was because there's a retreat center, a spiritual retreat center there. It was founded in the early 1940s by one of Meher Baba's disciples,
Okay.
Elizabeth Chapin, who had an interesting woman in her own right. But anyway, I ended up moving down there to be near the Meher Baba Center.
Okay.
And that's where I met this artist
Awesome.
who I worked for and apprenticed myself to.
Right. So during that time, you're being shaped by a sense of connectedness with bright individuals who aren't tied to kind of what you saw your dad kind of enslaved to, this like corporate system. They're free in that sense, and they're seeking the stuff that really had value to you.
A lot of artists, a lot of poets, a couple of filmmakers. The older disciples of Meher Baba, some of them were in their 60s and 70s that I met, were all to a person articulate, thoughtful, intellectually alive,
Yeah.
not stuck in the corporate, mold,
Right.
and not stuck in what seemed to me to be a dusty, musty religious mold
Right.
that had lost its meaning.
Right. That makes sense.
Which is what Christianity
Yeah.
looked like. Even though I actually believed in Jesus, I never stopped believing in Jesus since I was a little kid.
Yeah.
I always loved Jesus, and I always wanted to follow Jesus.
Hmm.
But trying to find Jesus in the Christian church
Right.
was a real challenge, and
Absolutely.
still is.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Sadly. And
Yeah.
especially when you have that family life that's not plugged into a vibrant community,
Right.
and that is really not seeking that lifestyle.
Right, exactly.
I mean, your first church is your family, really. And
Right.
so that's kind of from there makes it a little difficult.
Yeah.
But in some ways, what do you think captured you about Jesus at that point then? That he
When I was a
stayed
kid,
constant? Yeah, when you were a kid. What
and all
stayed
through my
constant?
teens and all the way through my adult years. Yeah. Well, that's easy to answer. I mean, anyone who really reads the Gospels with an open mind, believer or a non-believer, I don't see how they can fail to find Jesus to be an extraordinarily attractive, enigmatic, but extremely attractive figure.
Yeah.
Anyone who loves the truth, or anyone who loves, who wants to overcome their own internal sense of contradiction, because Jesus, he's very clear. I mean, on some level, he confronts the falsehood
Yeah.
of those in power around him. He confronts those who want to deceive themselves He confronts them with truth. Those who are broken and needy and have self-hatred, he confronts with love and
Yeah.
tenderness and forgiveness. Um, Whatever you believe about Jesus, I don't think there's anyone who can fail to find him at least a compelling figure.
Right.
But I actually took him to be from the time I was very little. I remember as a kid going to Sunday school and hearing stories about Jesus and going away thinking, I wish I had lived 2,000 years ago.
Mm.
That's the way I remember thinking that when I was a kid.
Wow.
I
Yeah.
wish I'd lived 2,000 years ago because I would have been near him. I would have stayed near him.
Yeah. That's amazing. And that's something that, like, even though your parents weren't diligent necessarily in raising up the child's in the Christian faith or being
Right.
really involved in a community like that, even that little bit, it got a hold of you, you know, and that's probably made all the difference in all the ways.
And actually, the attraction for Meher Baba is probably that very same thing.
Yeah, of course.
Because Baba looked like Jesus. I mean, all the pictures you saw, Jesus had long hair and a beard, and wore robes and spoke about love and about a spiritual path, and had a really an immensely charismatic personality.
Yep.
His disciples were like that too. They were incredibly loving.
Right.
And it was almost as though Jesus were walking around on the earth in the 20th century.
Of course. And so you were like, I want to be a part of that.
Yeah.
I want to get a part of that radical.
Exactly.
That's awesome. Do you feel like you actually mentioned when you were talking about Jesus that for people with self-hatred, he reacted with love? Do you feel like that was something you were wrestling with in the midst of that time?
I don't think I had any issue with self-hatred. I think it was more I was trying to a couple things. One, I was trying to explain to myself or get an explanation or some insight into why I was inclined to ecstatic experience. Because from the time I've been a little boy, ever since I was a little boy, I've had ecstatic experiences. I mean, I could describe them to you, but that might not be appropriate for this podcast. I'm sure there's no doubt in my mind that's why I'm an artist.
Yeah.
That's also been my attempt to try to get at what is happening to me.
Right.
Why is it that I have these? My grandparents used to call me the Little Philosopher when I was a kid. My parents used to say things. My parents would say when I'd try to describe an experience to them, they'd say, "Brucey, you're just a very different kid."
Yeah. Didn't really know how to respond.
Yeah. I remember one time I did a big drawing, about 4 foot tall drawing. And I showed it to my dad, and he was just flabbergasted. And he said, "Bruce, you should be really proud of yourself. That's amazing." And I said, "Dad, you don't understand. I'm not proud of myself. I didn't do this.
Yeah.
It did itself through me."
Yeah.
And he just looked at me like I had 6 eyes.
Oh, wow.
He couldn't, and that's all the best I could do at the time was to say, I didn't do this. It did itself through me.
Yeah.
The drawing seemed to have come through my hands.
Right.
And that was my experience of making the drawing.
Right.
So that mystical side of my life was so prominent as a kid.
Yeah.
But no one around me seemed to understand it.
Wow. And especially in the Western church at that time.
Oh, yeah.
Which
there's no room for mystics and artists.
Tossed out mysticism. Yeah.
Yeah. Mystics and artists have always been misfits in the Christian church.
Right. And they almost maybe couldn't have been as powerful as they were if they weren't misfits in some ways. You could say some of what made them so unique and mystical might have been the misfit. Yeah. But that's really fascinating. And so you think during that time, was it mainly stuff that had to do with art that your experiences were?
Well, no. I mean, I think art making has always been with me. I think it wasn't until I was an adult that I really realized that art making was going to be the main means, not so much of accessing mystical experience as translating it for others.
Right.
Because whenever I tried to talk about it, people would just go blank.
Of course. That makes sense.
Or they think I was crazy.
Yeah.
And I know I'm not crazy.
Right.
You know, because I'm perfectly happy, functional human being, highly responsible.
Right.
I'm not a kook.
Right.
But I am, for lack of a better term, a natural mystic. I couldn't help it. I'm not proud of it. I'm not ashamed of it anymore. I was probably, I don't know if I was ever ashamed of it, but I was certainly
aware of how
it didn't fit in.
Yeah.
In my family or among my friends, a lot of my friends. Although I did in high school, I did find a group of friends who were kind of inclined that way.
Yeah.
They were all taking LSD.
Of course, they had a way in.
Yeah. Well, at least with the mind-changing drugs, you could have at least some corroboration that your tendency in that direction has some validity.
Right.
The problem is, I was involved in that whole thing for about 1.5 years, and I quit being involved simply because I realized it was not going anywhere.
Right.
The trouble with these psychedelic drugs is that they have a semblance of mystical encounter with the divine, but it's drug induced, and so of course it wears off at the very least. But at the worst, it can become demonic.
Of course, easily,
because you're opening yourself up to spiritual influences that normally you're protected from.
Yeah, right.
But the drug basically breaks
down those barriers.
Breaks down the barrier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So, and you were very aware then of the divine because of these experiences.
From the time I was a little boy.
And that's something that you don't see often, right? You know, most people don't have that initial awareness, and kind of they grow into it if they do at all. Do you feel like when you were in this searching, did you have a natural sense of what was when you were encountering people who were naturally inclined towards mysticism, and were you drawn to those type of people then? I'm assuming.
Well, I don't know. Yeah, I suppose it was more that it was good to know that there are other people out there who kind of belonged to my tribe, as it were.
Yeah.
Could we just stop for a minute and talk about the word mysticism?
Absolutely.
I don't think I've ever really been drawn to mysticism as an ism, or it's more that for whatever reason, the way I've been hardwired from the time I was little is to have what most people will consider to be extraordinary, ecstatic encounters with God. However, what you do about such encounters is really what matters. Does it change your life? Does it make you become a kind of person who truly does live a life of love?
Yeah.
Or does it make you narcissistic and kind of thinking you're something special?
Yeah.
Because I think that there's the potential for that as well. There's potential for exile in the sense that you don't fit in.
Right.
Which is certainly what I experienced.
Yeah.
And there's also the potential for narcissism and starting to think, wow, I'm a cut above all the rest.
Right.
I've got direct access to God, or blah, blah, blah. Which, of course, is worse in some ways than feeling like an exile. I think that sense of exile is inevitable for anyone that follows Jesus.
Absolutely.
I mean, he said so himself.
Yep.
The Son of Man has no place to lay his head. Foxes have holes, birds have nests, but if you follow me, think twice.
Right.
Because it's going to cost you.
Yeah, count the cost.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. So to bring it more kind of forward in the story, you have this artist who really impacts you, obviously becomes a mentor, gives you that kind of drive to pursue art as your medium. And then you end up coming to Boston and you go to Boston College?
No, actually, well, I first came to Boston just looking for art schools. I looked down in Rhode Island at Rhode Island School of Design, looked at the Museum School in Boston. I looked at Mass College of Art. I wasn't that impressed with the work that the students were doing.
Right.
I just walked into the school cold. I didn't make an appointment. I didn't look at their catalog. I didn't talk to an admissions counselor. I just walked in and I just peeked into classrooms, and I wasn't that impressed with what the students were doing. So I thought, not so much. I don't think I'll go to this school. And then I happened to walk into, I found out that Boston University had an art program. I went over there and looked and discovered that the students were all doing really highly competent drawing and painting and sculpture based on observation, which is what I wanted to learn, the kind of traditional skills, art skills. They weren't particularly creative, but that didn't matter to me. I just wanted to know how to learn how to paint and draw and sculpt, and I wanted to learn the skills.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I ended up going to BU, which at the time in 1973 was considered anachronistic because everybody in the other schools were practicing abstract art, and they were more market driven, more whatever happened to be
the fad
in style or whatever.
Yep.
Yeah, but BU had stuck to this more classical training, which I really valued, and so I ended up going to BU eventually. But I got accepted in 73. I didn't end up going until I think 75. 74, 75.
Right. And were you just still living with the mentor in South Carolina?
No, actually I had moved up here, and I was living in Gloucester.
Okay.
In fact, I got married in the interim. And Meg, my wife, got pregnant with our first child before I even started at BU.
Wow. I didn't realize you were that young.
Yeah.
That's awesome. And how did you meet her?
I picked her up hitchhiking.
Oh my gosh, that's fantastic.
I had the car that time. She was the hitchhiker.
That's awesome. And then was that on your way to Boston then?
No, she was on her way to school. She was going to Montserrat College of Art.
Oh, well, that's awesome. That's
And I
where
was,
my wife went.
you
So,
really?
yeah, absolutely.
What
She
do you know?
graduated a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
So,
My wife never graduated, but she went in the early 1970s. Yeah.
very different school, I'm sure,
Yeah.
at that point.
Yeah.
That's awesome. And so, at that point, were you still following
Meher
this?
Baba?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And then was she on board with that as well, or?
Well, Meg used to joke about it. She'd say, "Well, Bruce follows Baba, and I follow Bruce."
That's awesome. That's funny.
But she liked Baba.
Of
I mean,
course,
she
yeah.
liked the teachings, seemed right to her.
Right.
Yeah.
And then you finally get enrolled with Boston University, and you just study painting.
Yeah, I took their basic core curriculum, and then I ended up focusing on painting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's awesome. And then when along this journey, then do you end up encountering Jesus in a real community way, where you find Christians who are kind of able to engage on a level that you hadn't seen before?
Well, here's the short form of that story. My brother Jack, after my older brother's death,
Right.
my parents went into a tailspin.
Yeah.
And they started going back to church. Now, I had left home at that point.
Right.
Of course, they went back to the Episcopal Church, which is the church we grew up in.
Of course. Yeah.
And they weren't getting answers,
Yeah.
but they started going anyway, just because they felt
Needed
like
something.
they needed something. And then they encountered a kind of a born again experience in that church. There was a renewal movement back in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s in the Episcopal Church
Okay. Mm-hmm.
called, it was a charismatic movement of
Right.
sorts. They had a born again experience where they had an encounter with Christ, and their faith came alive.
Mm.
They ended up leaving the Episcopal Church after that and joined the Christian Missionary Alliance.
Okay.
Both of my younger brothers ended up in the CNMA church too.
Mm.
And one of them, Jack, the older of the two younger brothers, Jack, ended up going to seminary and getting ordained and became a missionary and married and had 6 kids and ended up a missionary in the Philippines.
Wow.
And Jack and I would have these marathon conversations about Baba versus Jesus.
All right.
And I was a lot more versed in philosophy, and I was a lot more verbally capable than he.
Yeah.
But he was very devoted to Jesus.
Right.
And he kept saying to me, "Bruce, I'm not so sure about Baba. Let's talk."
Yeah.
We'd have these conversations, and I would always win the argument, as it were,
Right.
that
Verbally.
yeah, verbally. And basically my argument was always the same, which is what Baba's point of view, which was that all the world's religions essentially teach, all the great world religions teach essentially the
Right.
same thing,
Right.
which is love God and love your neighbor.
Yep.
And, it doesn't matter if you're a Muslim or Jew or Christian, a Hindu, a Buddhist, as long as you practice that
Right.
and you get to the heart of what that religion is about, which
Right.
is loving God
Right.
and then also loving your neighbor
Mm-hmm.
as yourself, which is a good argument.
Yeah. It's a hard one to overcome. That's for sure.
Yeah. Of course, it isn't arguments that get you into the kingdom of God.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, I said this was going to be a short form of the story, so it's getting long.
It's somewhat important, I think.
Well, in December of 1982, well, prior to that summer of 1982, I had a dream that shook me up so bad that I woke up in a cold sweat.
Wow.
And when I was waking up, I called out the name Jesus.
Wow.
I didn't call out Baba.
Mm.
I called out the name Jesus.
Mm.
And I heard myself say his name out loud, which is what woke me up.
Mm.
And my wife is sound asleep next to me. I'm in a cold sweat, 4 o'clock in the morning, or even earlier, I don't know. And I couldn't stop thinking about that. I won't tell you the dream, but anyway.
Yeah.
And then that fall, same year, 1982, I had another one of these shake you up type dreams.
Wow.
And I woke up from the dream, and in that case, the dream was my brother and I having one of those conversations again.
Mm.
But in the middle of the dream, Jack, my brother, holds up his hand and says, hold it. I can solve what the difference is between us now. Finally. And I was all ears, of course, in the dream. And he said in the dream, and I'll never forget it, it's clear as day, he said, "Bruce, you're content to make a couple of large metaphysical commitments. But as a Christian, I'm called to make multitudes of tiny daily commitments."
Oh, wow.
And I woke up from that dream wanting to have a comeback, but I had no comeback.
I had nothing. Mm.
So I was really shook up, and I started thinking about maybe I need to really reevaluate. And by Christmas that year, a couple months later, I actually was in one of those conversations with my brother, because we all got together at Christmas time.
Of course.
And everybody had gone to bed because, Jack and Bruce were having one of those long conversations again. And in the middle of the conversation, I said, Jack, I need to be level with you. I don't think I've been completely transparent with you. I'm really doubting Meher Baba, and I'm doubting the whole thing about the kind of universalism that he teaches, and I really have no doubts about Jesus. So I think I need to become a disciple of Jesus, because being a disciple of Baba just isn't right.
Right.
I don't really believe that Baba is God, whereas I do believe that Jesus is.
Wow.
And Jack said, wow.
Yeah, he was probably shocked.
He was shocked. And I said, but I don't know what to do. He said, well, it's really easy. It's kind of embarrassingly easy. You just say, he said, why don't we pray together?
Yeah.
So we knelt down right there.
Yeah.
Like 12:01 a.m. or whatever. It was early in the morning on the day after Christmas, I guess, 1982. And he said, just pray these simple words. Lord, I accept you, Jesus, as my Lord and as my Savior. And I renounce all the things of evil, including all the affiliation that I've had with other masters, Meher Baba, whatever. And so I said those simple words, and I felt tremendous relief. And then it was just a couple minutes. And then he said, well, why don't we just go to bed? It's late.
Yeah.
And we can talk tomorrow.
Yeah.
And I just thought, great. And I slept like a kitten.
Oh, man, that's funny.
Woke up the next day. We took a long walk. My brother Jack said, among other things that he said, Bruce, I need to break some bad news to you. He said, by becoming a disciple of Jesus doesn't mean you can hang your hat. Because he said, you're not going to find acceptance in the church because you're an artist and you're different.
Wow.
And you're kind of a natural mystic, and people are not going to understand you.
Wow.
And he said, Christians they're people that are worth loving, but they're not necessarily people you're going to want to hang out with.
Yeah. Wow.
Isn't that crazy?
That's hilarious.
I'm so glad my brother warned me, because that was my first day as a mature adult follower of Jesus. I was warned about the church.
Right.
And that they're not going to really love what I have to say.
They might need you, but they might not love
Right. They may not like it.
But that's amazing.
Yeah,
That's awesome.
I'm sorry, that's a lot longer than I intended.
But it's a powerful story. And that's something that, it's so cool to hear, because I'm sure there are many people out there who have that brother or who have that friend who just seems smarter, seems more in touch with these things, but they know that they are devoted to Jesus. And so that's a powerful story.
And that was 34 years ago.
Wow. That's awesome.
Almost, 33 years
coming
ago.
Up on it. Yeah. That's cool. And then from that point, did you just dive into the Bible? Did you...
Actually, I went a little overboard.
I figured you might. You seem like the person to just jump in.
Yeah. And unfortunately, my wife was not enthusiastic.
Yeah, I would think
she
that's a difficult
did not
transition.
Want to have anything to do with a Jesus freak.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I told her the next day, I said, I talked to Jack last night, and, I've actually turned my life over to Jesus.
Yeah.
She said, no. I said, yep. She said, this is not what I signed on for.
Oh, wow.
And in the weeks after that, of course, I started trying to read scripture to her like an idiot.
Yeah.
And she just got more and more defensive. And she finally said, you know what? I'm done.
Wow.
I'm cooked. I'm out of here.
Wow.
And she started to see a lawyer for divorce. And it was pretty grim. It was worse than pretty grim. It was completely grim for about 10 months. And I won't go into the details, but it was as though we were divorced.
Wow.
And it was going to end in divorce. But then, as Meg tells a story, I wish she were here to pick up and tell a story. She's a lot more accurate storyteller than I am. But she said after that period, she said she had seen such a profound change in my character, which she didn't think was possible, that she said she had to at least consider the claims of Christ and try to work on our marriage, which was pretty damaged.
Yeah.
For all the years that I've been following Baba, which even though on the surface it looked good, underneath there was this kind of subterranean tide that was gnawing away at the basis of the bond between us.
Yeah.
Because I was giving devotion to a false god. Basically I was worshiping Meher Baba.
Right.
And if you worship anything less than God, it's almost as though you're committing adultery.
Right.
So in a way, I had given her just cause to leave.
Interesting.
Because the love that belonged to her probably was going to Meher Baba, along with the worship that belonged to God that was going to Meher Baba.
Yeah.
And it was a mess. And I think I realized that in some inchoate way. I don't know that I could have said it as succinctly as that.
Of course.
But the realization that I had gone wrong and that I had damaged our marriage humiliated and humbled me. And eventually she did get the message that, I was a changed man.
Wow.
And that I needed to change a lot more.
Of course. I'm sure she never lost sight of that.
but we started getting some marriage counseling, and she started going to church with me, and eventually she committed her life to Christ, and then both our children ended up committing their lives to Christ independently of us.
Wow.
You know,
How old were they at that time?
Ben was 8 and Sarah was about 4.
Wow. Yeah. Formative years.
Yeah.
That's awesome though. And I mean, the fact that you were able to admit that it was you that needed to change.
It was all me.
That's awesome. Because I mean, I'm sure that when you first said, I'm a follower of Christ, and she said, okay, that's done. You're like, but I did the right thing.
Right, exactly.
And so,
yeah, I was full of myself.
Yeah.
As usual. And, but it was the recognition that, that I had to change.
Yeah.
For her sake.
Yeah.
And actually, at one point, I actually realized that I might have to let her go.
Wow.
For her sake.
Wow.
And I did. I think that's what was the turning point for us, was me communicating to her that I had let go of her, and I was not going to try to stop her from becoming who she wanted to become.
Right.
And then she felt more able to commit to our relationship and start building it all over again. As our marriage counselor at that time told us, you built this wall brick by brick, you're going to have to take it down brick by brick.
Yeah.
It's a painstaking and hard, but also very worthwhile process.
Right. Ultimately.
Yeah. And that was a long time ago. We have a very strong, very healthy marriage.
Yeah.
It's not perfect.
Yeah.
I don't know any perfect marriages. They may exist, but I've never seen one.
But you're doing what you do, and it's built from that foundation onward.
Right.
Started to make it right.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
But I mean, one thing you probably have some other questions, but one thing I want to add there, how are we doing time-wise?
We're doing okay. We've got about another 25 minutes or so to hit the hour. Yep.
Okay. One little parenthetical thought for people that don't understand the whole Eastern philosophy tradition, who might be listening to this.
Yeah.
There's shared ground in all the world's great monotheistic religions, and even some of the religions that aren't monotheistic, that teach the love of God and the love of your fellow human beings.
Yeah.
So on a moral level, there's a lot of shared ground.
Right.
When it comes to metaphysical understandings, and I would take that a step further and say spiritual realities.
Yeah.
The world's religions are not teaching the same thing.
Yeah.
At all.
Mm-hmm.
And so you might ask, well, so what does it matter that you have these metaphysical understandings versus the practical matter of really showing respect and care for your fellow human beings, and then your love of God? Well, the problem is, from my point of view now, if you love or worship anything less than the genuine God, than God himself, that love is going to be distorted.
Yeah.
That worship is going to get twisted. And that's what happened in my life.
Right.
And I did not have a good, solid basis for marriage.
Right.
I didn't have a solid basis for raising my children.
Yeah.
It was undermined by idolatry.
Right.
And idolatry will have its way with you eventually. It may take years, but it will destroy you.
Right.
If you worship anything less than God, you will become less than what you were ever meant to be.
Yeah.
So what about the morality then? What about the love God and love your neighbor? Well, first of all, you can't love God if you're loving some idol.
Right.
So it undermines your actual capacity to love your neighbor properly.
Right.
You can't love humanity. You can only love persons.
Right.
To love humanity, this abstraction called love humanity, is nonsense.
True.
Because you can be a total shark.
Yeah.
And pretend to be a pussycat.
Right.
You can be a total fake.
Right.
And look like you're loving humanity, but in fact, you only love yourself.
Wow. Yeah.
You can be a total narcissist and convince yourself that you're really loving your neighbor. Well, you're not loving your neighbor. To love your neighbor, you can only, the only way, to my way of thinking, the only way you can really learn to love your neighbor properly is if you love God. And God teaches you what it means to love persons one at a time.
Right.
And it's messy and it's difficult, and you have to overcome a lot of sin and ugliness. Yeah. And there's a lot of forgiveness needed. It's not easy. It's not a nice little spiritual path that you never have to get dirty.
Take up your cross. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and what's interesting about what you're saying too is A lot of people, especially people who are not in Christianity, look at God and say, like, so what's the deal with him saying you have to worship me and me alone?
Right.
And they can often misunderstand it as a selfish motivation,
Right.
which, I mean, selfish doesn't even work for God, because him loving himself would be to love us. But
Right.
the whole idea is that it's actually us that need to worship him. It's not him
Right.
that needs our worship.
Right.
He was completely complete in the triune being before the beginning of time, but he created us, and he wants us to be in that perfection of loving him. And if you love anything less, you'll become the flaws that you love in that thing, you know.
Right.
And so the flawless being of God, who is, you know, humanity's made in that image, will allow you to start bringing out the divine in the people around you and loving the divine that you see in them, because you first loved the true divine.
Right. I mean, one way of thinking about it is a kind of simplistic analogy, but in when you're navigating on the open ocean,
Yeah.
you know, if you're only traveling 25 or 30 miles, if you're a couple points off on the compass, it's not a big deal. You can correct your course.
Right.
But if you're traveling 3,000 to 6,000 miles across the open ocean, and you're a couple points off on the compass, it's the difference between Paris or Calais and the Cape of Good Hope.
Wow. Yeah.
I mean, you're way, way off course.
Absolutely.
So we're talking about a journey of a lifetime and then ultimately of eternity.
Yeah.
If you're aiming in the wrong direction, if your love is aimed in the wrong direction, it's going to take you way off course.
Yeah.
That's the simplest way of thinking about it.
That's true.
And as you say, if you worship anything less, you will become like the thing you worship.
Right. Exactly. That's awesome. Well, that was a great kind of contextualization for that.
Sure.
One thing that I think is really interesting is your commentary on the church. So we've talked a lot, and we've said, you know, the church has not had a place for mystics and for artists.
Right.
How do you feel you have, to bring it less out of the ideological realm, but how do you feel like you in your ministry as an artist have begun to, I guess, heal the gap, or kind of be a part of the change that the church needs? Because I think a lot of people who, if they have involvement in the church and are aware of what's going on, have seen that there has been some change in the contemporary Western church to start allowing space for artists and mystics, you know?
Yeah. Well, it's been more than 3 decades now.
Yeah.
For me personally. I mean, the simplest way to put this is, if you take offense at the fact that you're not understood and welcomed completely, if you take offense and you leave, well, nothing will change. You'll just confirm the suspicions of those who rejected you.
Right.
But if, on the other hand, you take a different posture and you say, well, these people don't understand and accept me fully, but they're perfectly lovable people.
Yeah.
And it's just a misunderstanding maybe, or maybe maybe I have to be an educator. I have to be someone who helps them to understand the value of the direct kind of ecstatic encounter with God on the one hand, the more mystical experience, or the realm of the arts on the other.
Right.
So, and I have taken that because, I think partly because, thanks to my brother who warned me that next day, you know, look, you're not going to find a comfy armchair to sit in among evangelical Christians as an artist. Because I was put on notice that first day, I've never been surprised or hurt particularly. Maybe I've been frustrated a bit at times by the fact that people like me don't find a really comfy place in the evangelical subculture. But I've been here at Gordon for most of that time. I've been here at Gordon 32 years.
Wow.
And that was, so about a year and a half after my conversion, I ended up teaching here at Gordon. I've spent, more than 3 decades of my life dedicated not just in the classroom, but also in my art to trying to serve the church.
Right.
And if you take a servant's posture rather than a kind of offended, entitled prima donna posture, you get a lot further.
Of course.
And I've made a lot of friends. I've felt very challenged, but also loved and supported here at Gordon over the last 30 years. And I like to think that in some small way I've made a contribution to that issue, that what you were saying is this kind of gradual thaw towards artists and the more mystical side of Christian tradition within evangelicalism. And I like to think there's a room there. I mean, there are some rumblings right now in this current political environment where it looks like evangelicalism has been discredited,
Hmm.
and there's a strong temptation to say, I really don't want to be called an evangelical.
Right.
And I'll be honest, I feel that same way at times.
Of
I
course.
just
Right.
feel like, why do I have to be associated with people who are going to support candidates who I know are antithetical to the Christian message?
Yeah.
Just because they want to be on the winning side or something. I don't know. I can't figure out why anyone
Right.
would, but there
Whatever
it is.
reason. Yeah.
And it's just difficult. But
Absolutely.
but you soldier through. And so I think what I was going to say there is the simplest answer is take a servant's posture,
Yeah.
and you learn a lot,
Right.
and you get a lot further along in the process than if you get defensive and angry and
Right.
act like people should be rolling out the red carpet for you.
Right. That's amazing, because I think I was when you said serve with your art, like that's got to be hard to do. I mean, I'm sure it's your thing, it's your expression, and you want it to be appreciated. But when you say I'm doing it to serve the church, that's like submitting your gifts in that way. And I'm sure that there's been times where it's been hard, but it's probably, I mean, that's probably why you're at this place where it seems that you're flourishing. You obviously have a lot of recognition and acclaim within certain circles of the Christian church.
Well, that's I think a true statement. One of the sad things about the whole artistic enterprise is that it doesn't, you can't just sort of be anonymous and supply your gift and get out of the way.
Right.
There's a certain amount of promotion that has to happen, and the whole celebrity self-promotion thing that is required of artists is, to me, distasteful and unfortunate, but it just is where we're at in this culture. And what I've tried to do to subvert it a little bit is that whenever I go somewhere where people have heard of my work and think it's important or whatever, I tend to try to diffuse that situation and say, look, just a servant here, just like you. Um, I'd like to think that the church could understand that the visual arts are as valuable to their life as music, for example,
Absolutely.
or the word. Christ is referred to as the Word of God,
Yeah.
the living Word of God, but he's also referred as the true icon, the true image of God.
Right.
In Colossians, and he is the true image of God, the firstborn of all creation. We are all made in the image of God, but Christ is the image of God.
Absolutely.
So the visual arts should have a role, theoretically anyway. They should have a role in how we honor God.
Yeah.
My thought is, I'll just throw this out there for whoever's listening, or looking, as the case may be,
Yeah.
that if we brought our best before God in worship, in terms of architecture, in terms of art, in terms of music, in terms of poetry, in terms of dance, in terms of theater, if we brought all the best in terms of politics, in terms of, you name it, finance, if we bring our best before God and break it open before him like that costly ointment that was lavished on Jesus' feet,
Absolutely.
we will see an explosion of love and reverence for God in our culture.
Absolutely.
Instead of being culture critics,
Right.
and defensive and grasping for power within the political system,
Right.
like some people are inclined to do.
Yeah.
If Christians just simply brought their best before God,
Yeah.
and then offered it to the world at large and said, "Look, we're here for you. We're your servants."
Right.
We might get pie in the face. We might get slugged. We might get beheaded. We might get burned at the stake again. It's possible.
Yeah.
But my hunch is that probably more often than not, people are going to say, "Wow, I mean, Christians actually welcome you into the." I mean,
Yeah.
the reputation we have right now in the culture is we're a bunch of censors.
Right.
We're mean spirited. We're grasping. We're censorious. We're judgmental.
Yeah.
I'd love to reverse that and say I'd love for the reputation of evangelical Christians to be, "Wow, those Christians throw wild parties.
Yeah. Absolutely.
They have fun.
Yeah.
They make beautiful art.
Yeah.
They make beautiful music. They make great wine."
Right.
Well,
they say, truth, beauty, and goodness are with like the arch things in the ancient Greek philosophy that were sought after, and we have kind of really just focused on truth, and even lost some of the goodness along the way. But beauty, of course, was kind of tossed with the where my church meets in a gym, and I love my church, but like there's something lost when you're meeting in a gym,
Definitely.
And obviously there's arguments on both sides, but my home church, you know, had a revelation. They started as a charismatic non-denominational church that met wherever, you know, business buildings. They had a revelation that, hey, if God is beautiful, then why shouldn't his house be beautiful? Why shouldn't we represent him in the world? Beautiful. And so I grew up in a beautiful church, and so coming out here going to a gym was kind of funny, but I think what you're saying has a lot of poignant truth for this time, and I think it's very relevant.
There's just so long that you can worship God in a gymnasium before your faith gets stunted somehow. I actually believe, I mean, I'm not saying anything against that. I mean, if that's the best people can do, that's the best they can do, and that's fine.
Yeah.
But if you have the opportunity to make a sacrifice,
right,
and to build a beautiful building and to decorate it beautifully for the sake of God's glory, I think you need to do that.
Yeah. Well, and I have to bring up one of my favorite quotes from Dostoevsky, which is "Beauty will save the world." Right. I mean, that's just like so poignant for what I think we're talking about.
Do you know where that comes from in Dostoevsky?
I think it comes from, doesn't it come from the Brothers K?
Nope.
No? The Idiot, maybe?
It comes from The Idiot.
Okay, yeah, I knew it was one of the two.
It's Prince Mishkin.
Yeah.
He is, you need to read the story. It's an amazing story because there's a certain kind of sad and poignant quality in when Mishkin says that.
Right.
It's not a straightforward statement, beauty will save the world.
Yeah.
Because in the story, the guy who voices that is totally marginalized at the end of the story. He ends up in a sanatorium in Switzerland as a total failure.
Wow.
But there's a certain poignancy there because Christ on the cross could be easily seen as a total failure.
Yeah.
He didn't topple the Roman Empire. He didn't fix everything and get the Jews out of trouble.
Right.
Their Messiah was a failed Messiah. And yet we believe that the cross is the very place where death is defeated, where sin is defeated. So there's some, you know, Dostoevsky really got that.
Oh, yeah.
He understood it.
Yeah.
So if beauty is going to save the world, it may not look so saved, is the point I would make.
Yeah, that's powerful, for sure.
I think it will, for him who has eyes to see or ears to hear, let him see and hear.
Yeah.
The kingdom of God is in your midst, Jesus said. But when he said that, the Sanhedrin, a totally hypocritical group of religious leaders, were in control. A petty governor, Pilate, was in control of the region. The Roman Empire, a vicious and bloodthirsty and extremely violent world system, was in control of the known world in that area. And yet Jesus says the kingdom of God is in your midst.
Yep.
What the heck is he talking about? And so if you say beauty is going to save the world, you better be prepared to deal with that kind of irony and ambiguity and paradox.
Right.
But I actually believe that's where the arts step in.
Yeah.
Is when it doesn't make sense rationally.
Yeah.
Because Jesus is saying to those people who are his listeners at that moment, the kingdom of God is right here and now.
Yeah.
Unless they were able to make that leap over the line into the world of metaphor and poetry and paradox, he must have sounded like a nutcase.
Absolutely.
Or someone who's under a really bad delusion.
And they did what they do with nutcases. They killed them.
Yeah.
You know, they ostracized them, threw them out.
Yeah.
That's crazy. Well, I think that that's a great call to the church, you know, to enter into that pursuit of beauty and truth and goodness again, you know, and
it's wrapped up in a mystery within a mystery, because unless you're willing to say, yes, indeed, the cross was the triumph, the ultimate triumph over death.
Yep.
And, you know, it's just too easy to say that.
Yeah.
You have to deal with the incredible seeming contradiction of that.
Yep.
That's where I think the arts can step in, because what we do is, you know, what's an artist going to do with that situation? They're going to write you a play.
Yeah.
That maybe gives you some little insight into how that might be true.
Right.
That Jesus defeated death on the cross.
Yep.
They're going to paint you a picture.
Which more pictures and images have been painted of the cross than anything else.
Yeah, you bet. Or they're going to write a really incredible, beautiful cantata.
Yeah.
You know, like the Passion, the St. Matthew Passion.
Right.
By Johann Sebastian Bach. One of the most powerful pieces of music ever written.
Yeah.
And yet it's about a terrible, terrible tragedy that ends in triumph if you're willing to be a person of faith.
Yeah.
But it's a matter of faith. It's not, there's no proof that Jesus defeated death, because people are still dying.
Yeah.
And evil is still running the show.
Yeah.
As far as I can tell.
Right. The kingdom is here, but it's subversive.
It's subversive, exactly. And it's only for those who are willing to open their eyes to it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, it's about that time.
Yeah.
So this has been amazing, as I suspected it might be. And thank you so much for just opening up about your life and ideas. And it's just been good. And I love having these conversations. So
Great talking
thanks
to
for
you,
being
Jesse.
on the podcast.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Thanks, man.